Welcome to the Dr. Bros, where we have an honest discussion around vet life in and out of the clinic. My name is Jeff. I'm your doc of the day and your guide through this episode. I'm a dermatology associate veterinarian working in Louisville, Kentucky, and I'm here with my closest friends from vet school.
Hey, this is Brandon. I'm a small animal internal medicine resident at Ames, Iowa, at Iowa State University.
Hey, this is Chris. I'm a GP in North Carolina.
And this is Adam. I am a relief veterinarian in Louisville, Kentucky.
And this is Jeff again, and I'm so excited to welcome back Dr. Andrea Hernández. So Dr. Andrea Hernández-Burés is a DVM. She was born and raised on the island of Puerto Rico. She completed her bachelor's degree at the University of Puerto Rico, Mayagüez campus, and graduated from Tuskegee University in 2017. Following graduation, she completed a small animal medicine and surgery rotating internship in Southwest Florida, and then worked in GP for a year as a part-time associate veterinarian while doing research with the dermatology service at the University of Florida. She then completed a specialty internship in dermatology at the University of Illinois and then moved to California to complete a dermatology residency at Animal Dermatology Clinic in Tustin. Welcome back, Dr. Andrea Hernández.
Thank you. Very happy to be back.
So glad to have you. And this time, instead of a normal opening game, we're actually going to do a listener letter. So this is from our Instagram. It comes from @LifeBoost with Amelia. The letter states, "Hey, I started listening to your podcast and love that it sounds like you guys are having fun while having great conversations. I really loved your discussion on burnout and appreciated everyone's vulnerability, sharing their own experiences. We need more of the honest conversations in vet med. I personally experienced burnout a few years ago, and I'm really passionate about creating positive change in vet med. I just wanted to share a free resource I created for the veterinary community called Beat the Burnout: What We Should Have Learned in Vet School. It's a series of 4 webinars sharing things the vet community can do individually and as hospitals to start beating burnout today. For anti-anxiety tools that actually work, that you can even use in the middle of surgery, this is the place to get them. Love that you're having a positive voice in the profession. Thanks for helping to spread the word. The high burnout rate shouldn't be our norm. I know you mentioned therapy and how many people are just too busy and stressed to even find someone, which is so true. And my goal with these webinars is to empower everyone with tools to shift out of survival mode and to start having clarity on what specifically is feeling hard and how to move forward in a way that feels doable." And the link is www.lifeboost.today/beatburnout. So we'll definitely put that in our show notes for you, and including the Instagram. We did get permission from Amelia to share that with you. This sounds like a really great resource. And please go back and listen to our episode number 5 of the Dr. Bros to hear our burnout discussion, aptly called The One About Burnout. And if you, a listener, want to have a message featured on our podcast, please send us a message on Instagram or shoot us an email, and we'll mention those again at the end of the podcast. So today we wanted to discuss something all veterinary professionals who work in clinics deal with from time to time in some form or fashion, and that is chronic disease management. Specifically, we wanted to get into client expectations and some communication tips. So for the most part, this will be a bit of an open discussion, and I'm really interested to see everybody's opinions on some of these topics and questions that we have, and learn something new myself. So first question will be to our lovely guests, and then anybody can answer. What is the most common chronic condition you see in your practice, and how do you set up your clients' expectations and goals for long-term care?
This is Andrea. So obviously I'm going to have to go with allergies, and Jeff, you probably agree with this. It's the number one thing. It's our bread and butter as specialists in the dermatology field. And yeah, in terms of how do we set up client expectations, it's very important. And I feel like not only it's our job as working in dermatology to set that expectation, but I feel like sometimes it's good for primary care veterinarians to set that precedent beforehand, because one common thing that I tend to see when I see not all clients, but most of them, is that when they come to me, the pet is eventually going to come off of all their allergy medications and that I'm going to cure basically their pet. And in all honesty, I very likely will not. Allergies, or I will not, because allergies are not a curable disease. Like with food allergies and flea allergies, yes, you can avoid the inciting allergen, and by avoidance, you can help prevent future flare-ups, but that's not really the case with atopic dermatitis or environmental allergies. There's always going to be periodic flares. So basically, right off the bat, when I have a first-time client, that's usually what I start off by saying. And before I go dive into my allergy spiel, I remind them like, hey, this is not a curable disease, but this is something that's manageable. Like, I don't also want to sound like very negative, but I do tell them like, this is not something that we're going to be able to cure, but we can find what's best for your pet to help manage them and keep them comfortable. And I also set the expectation that allergies are not a cookie cutter disease. So every pet responds differently to different treatments. So, and also the situation or the circumstances play a big role. So just because the pet didn't respond to Apoquel a year ago or Cytopoint that the vet tried, it doesn't mean that necessarily this time it won't work, because if the pet has secondary infections, which is a complicating factor, that can play a role as well in how well these medications are going to work. So that's usually the precedent that I set, that it's not a curable disease, but we can definitely manage it. And Jeff, I don't know if you have anything else to add to it, because of course you deal with these conditions as well.
Yeah, this is Jeff again. And I'll say, 100% all those things I totally agree with. The only thing that I would add a little bit to, I guess, because you kind of hit all my main points, is or I guess I'll reemphasize, it's really important as best you can to try to get on the same page with the client. But also I find that even when I was in general practice, sometimes a lot of our information is like drinking from a water hose from the client standpoint. So it's also important to read their body language and adjust how you're speaking. Are there other ways that you can transmit this information to them? Can you write something down? Can you provide a handout? Like even in GP, I had a whole file, like a small file cabinet by my desk, and I would pull out handouts from veterinarypartner.com and pull out like, ooh, this patient's here for something heart related or heard a heart murmur. I'll give them my spiel and then say, take this 1-page handout and go home, ask me about it or call me about it if you have further questions about what I'm recommending today, because we deal with so many chronic things and like heart things, dermatology things. It's going to be a long-term journey. So sometimes it does take more than one conversation, and it's okay to kind of open your owner up to understanding that it's okay for them to reach back out if they don't understand everything in that moment.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And one other thing that I wanted to add, and it's more of an expectation for vets and vet staff, is that you're very likely, if not definitely, gonna repeat yourself multiple times, because most clients, they need that gentle reminder, and it's okay. It's chronic diseases; they're very complicated, and I'm sure Brandon can pitch in on the chronic diseases that he manages. But a lot of times, we have to be that person that reminds clients and answer their questions over and over again, because it can definitely be very overwhelming. So empathy is a really big part of it as well, just to be empathetic and try to put yourself in the client's shoes, that they're the ones doing all these treatments, doing all these things. So that's something that I always try to remember myself when I'm managing these cases, like trying to put myself in my client's shoes as well.
Yeah, this is Brandon. I like a lot of what you guys said, like setting up expectations and goals from the beginning and having like a very short term like set of like expectations and a game plan, and then making sure the client's aware of the long term expectations and what like the disease process entails as far as progression down the road, Like if you can set that up from the beginning, there should be no surprises as things unfold. It can be complex on my end too. Like I think the most common one that I deal with is chronic kidney disease. And I know general practitioners can manage this and deal with this as well. There's a lot of great guidelines for general practitioners if a client can't see a specialist or maybe doesn't need to see a specialist. Some of this stuff can be done without the input of a specialist outside of like maybe an ultrasound. But I feel like a lot of general practitioners have access to that nowadays by getting a radiologist to come to a clinic or having an outpatient ultrasound done at a specialty referral hospital, having the results sent to you. But other things like immune-mediated diseases outside of the skin, like IMHA or IMPA, or there's a whole bunch of them. The kind of cookie cutter disease management is the same. It's a chronic condition. We're going to treat them with these drugs. We're going to try and take them off some of these drugs. Hopefully we'll get them off of some of them completely in some instances, but more likely than not, they're going to need to be managed forever. And if you can set that basic expectation from the beginning, I feel like clients are usually amenable to your game plan.
Hey, this is Chris. I was gonna jump in on those for. I mean, we see allergies all the time. Everything that's what I'm referring to you guys. We also see arthritis is probably the other one that I see the most, especially with these older dogs now. And so, again, it's how you guys are saying is you got to set that precedent. I've had a bunch of clients, they come in and they're frustrated, like, oh, the allergy wasn't fixed from that shot or that pill. And I kind of have to go, I know it's frustrating. I know it's not something that you were expecting like to be fixed, but it's not curable or stopping. Like you say, we're going to have to manage it. And there's also allergies change. Like, well, it worked last year. I was like, well, when was that? That was in the spring where it worked. Now we're in the fall or the summer. It's a different season now. There's different things blooming and doing different allergens now. And so it's just communicating, and it's just like you guys keep kind of beating the dead horse. Is just you got to over communicate and kind of reemphasize like there's no cure for this. It's we're going to manage it and do as best we can and kind of pivot as much as we need to.
And what about you, Adam? What are the kind of common things that you've come across, and how do you manage them?
So kind of like piggybacking off of what all you guys are saying, I'd say kind of with Chris too, also being in GP, allergies, arthritis, those are two big ones. Chronic kidney disease, diabetes, some Cushing's, those sorts of things. But again, having that clear and open communication with the owner and establishing from the get-go, this is a chronic disease. And then also having your protocol. So again, working at different clinics, some of them may have different protocols for how they want to do monitoring. Some of the clinics I work at, any patient that's on chronic medication, they like to do blood work every 6 months. So establishing that with the client up front as well of, there's going to be plenty of rechecks associated with this, and we need to, get that blood work done every 6 months, and establishing that from the start so the client that's not an unexpected thing when that time comes around. But again, having that clear and open communication from the start is key.
Yeah, this is Jeff again, and I totally agree. And I wanted to ask another question in this realm. So what are some challenges that you found when you're treating these chronic diseases and it's just not working?
This is Andrea. I would have to say that I guess the biggest challenge that I guess it depends on the case, but if I'm going to go with the most common one, it's probably the financial aspect of it. It can be a really big factor for a lot of clients. And unfortunately, for a lot of chronic conditions, both allergies and even autoimmune skin diseases, at least from my perspective, the most affordable medication that helps manage these conditions, it's steroids, which, yes, steroids work. They're great and they're needed in most of these cases, but they come with a lot of side effects. And again, we go back to setting that expectation with the client, like telling them like, hey, this will help, like it'll work, but there's a lot of side effects that come with this. And I guess for for me, it's a challenge because a lot of medications can be quite expensive, like Apoquel for bigger dogs and even Cytopoint. Atopica is another one that's very pricey. And even when we're managing autoimmune diseases, even though some of the other medications are not as expensive, like azathioprine, mycophenolate, those types of things, they still require lab work monitoring, especially with azathioprine initially, because there's a lot of very risky side effects. So it can add up, and the financial burden is very real. So definitely that's something that you have to talk to the client about and just basically work with what they can and just be open about it. Give them that option. Tell them upfront, hey, we can try this medication. It can be costly for certain for certain clients, but we can definitely make it work. Like, I like to offer them different options too. Like, it's my job. I always tell clients it's my job to give you all this information and for you to make the best and most informed decision possible. And I tell them you can get them on like Chewy or Costco pharmacy. I give them basically options for them to make the best informed decision for the pet. And we work around that as much as possible.
This is Adam. Another challenge that I've faced, along with financial, because obviously that's a big factor. But another one is compliance. And when I say compliance, that's not always a client just failing to understand or really take in what's going on with it. It could be out of their control. I mean, you could have someone who is an elderly owner who can't administer medications, or you could have a dog who's the sweetest dog, but you go to give it medications and it's just not having it. So there may be things that are kind of out of the client's control in terms of administering medications or things that kind of hinder compliance. So I think having an open, again, comes back to communication, right? So having that open conversation with the client, and if these factors or these barriers are in the way, encouraging them to present those to you and trying to work with them for alternatives. One thing that comes to mind in terms of that would be route of administration. So for some medications, if it's in capsule form or pill form, if we could get it compounded into a liquid. For diabetes in cats especially, they've now come out with Bexacat, which is an oral alternative to injections. So things like that are things to kind of have that communication with the owner and, encourage them to communicate with you the barriers and the challenges that they foresee so that you can help them find an alternative.
And this is Jeff again. And Adam, everything you said, I think, was spot on. You made some really, really helpful points, I think, that I hadn't even thought about. And then, Andrea, I appreciate you bringing up financial. I wasn't even thinking about that when I wrote that question, but I think it's a really good point, is that things can be going well, but we do have to deal with those barriers of clients who simply can't afford things, and medicine's becoming more expensive over time, and it affects us and our businesses. It affects every part of medicine. And so sometimes it is really important to get creative, especially in those situations. Like if a culture, for example, classic patient comes in, has had several rounds of antibiotics, we're suspicious of a resistant staph infection as an example, and I want to culture it. That sometimes that's not reasonable. Cultures run, I think, close to $300 or more right now just for a routine aerobic culture. And even though that would be the best way to choose an antibiotic, sometimes I have to get a little creative, and I know that I can reach for a 3 to 4% chlorhexidine shampoo, and you can bathe daily with that if it's a dog that can be bathed. One of our mentors even mentioned, for potentially for money cases or cases from fighting an infection as an example, for a large breed dog, you can even take dilute chlorhexidine and put it onto the hose and douse large breeds or like a Great Dane outside and rinse them in that way to help with resistant infections too, which I had never thought of. I think I learned that sometime in my residency. And that's also a very inexpensive way to treat them, even though you can't do quote unquote the gold standard or the ivory tower goal. And the last point I was going to make there was just when you have a case that's not going well as a doctor, don't forget to look at your case with new eyes, take a step back. I do this for my own cases when I think I'm doing all the right things and I've done everything I can think of off the top of my head. Take a step back, go through the records, read it again, look at the case with new eyes, and remind yourself every time you see even your rechecks to look at the cases with new eyes, because you might be missing something. And of course, reach out to a friend, ask somebody else about it, look up resources, books, Venn, reach out, get a specialist on the phone if you need to. Even I call other specialists, and I'm in derm only world, but I need help too. So we're all humans. And so if we can adjust and pivot, just don't forget that there's always something you can do, but maybe you haven't thought of it yet. Another question I had for the group, and some of these I think we've hit a little bit, but in different chronic diseases, they can be very confusing for our clients, and they still may not understand you even after we re-explain things. What are some ways that you can improve your communication and adjust how we communicate with them to help clients better understand?
So this is a very good question. Usually, basically, if it's like let's say, for example, an elderly client, or maybe even a younger client, like because I do have clients that are college students and they bring their pets to me and they don't know what pemphigus is or autoimmune is, a lot of things. So I like using diagrams, or basically using a whiteboard to like explain like the disease process. And like I tell them, hey, so this is the skin barrier. Think of it normally as a brick wall that it just protects the body from foreign organisms. And in pemphigus, the body attacks certain structures within that wall. So it helps break these little bricks, and the bricks are the keratinocytes, and then they become detached. So, and using that analogy, or using a lot of analogies, that helps a lot. Not only with autoimmune diseases, but also even with chronic ear infections too. Showing them a diagram of the actual ear and showing them like, hey, this is what the ear canal looks like in a dog. It's way longer and it's an L shaped. It's not as short like ours is. So this is a lot of complications that can happen. We can get debris entrapment and all those types of things. So I am a big fan of drawing and also showing them images, because I'm a visual learner, and I feel like a lot of people actually visualizing things helps.
Hey, this is Chris. So I'm pretty much the same way, you kind of help visualize it for the owner. So I like to use, especially with arthritis or any type of joint bone disease going on, is we have models. So we'll show them on the model, like of the leg or the bone, like, hey, this is where the arthritis is at, or hey, this is where your ACL is torn, or kind of just showing them on the model. That's a way for them to see, hey, this is where it's at on the bone. This is why your dog is limping and having issues there. Analogies are great too. I use those all the time, trying to simplify it so that way they can understand it from our perspective. Because again, we went through all these years of school to understand it pretty easily, but we need to be able to explain it. And so, yeah, definitely using analogies. And I try to draw. It looks terrible when I draw, and I tell people I'm better at the medicine and the surgery part than my drawing. But this is kind of a crude idea of what's going on with it. But it's just trying to all the different ways to make them understand it and help them understand it. And you might still do that, and they still might not understand it, and that's okay. It's just trying to figure out a way for them and having them say, "What don't you understand? We'll go over it again." And a lot of times they like that, and I'll sit there in the room and I'll be like, I'll ask them 5-6 times, "Do you have any other questions? Anything else you can think of?" All right, I'm going to go get the medicine. I'll come back here, think of a question if you don't have one, but try to think of something else that you can think of, because sometimes when you're in the room, they just get shell shocked and they're like, I don't even know what to do. And so they don't want to ask a question. And so I usually, when I come back, they have 3 or 4 more questions, and it's fine. I just go over it with them and go slow with them. And they love it for that. And I think that kind of builds more rapport with them too. When you're like, you want all the questions, you sit down with them and just say, hey, tell me what you need or what you need to know to understand this better. And I think, again, it just goes back to just great client communication.
This is Jeff. And one thing I wanted to mention that I thought was really helpful that you said there, Chris, was like and Andrea, like I also love diagrams. I also literally say, I am not an artist. I'm a terrible drawer, but here's an ear canal, and I'll draw like this bad open L. So, if I don't have a whiteboard with me, I'll even make an L in the room and say, like, this part of my thumb is where the tympanum is. The rest of this L that I'm making with my index finger and my thumb is the eardrum. Pretend my index finger is like the pinna. And then I'll kind of point down, like, when you're not cleaning the ear, our medication can't get past the little curve where my thumb is. And it can't get past the tympanum unless there's a hole in it. And I'll try to break it down like that. I've drawn on pieces of paper. We do have whiteboards in most of our exam rooms. So just making sure you can make adjustments and changes is super helpful. And I've even had owners where, like, I've explained a diet trial, and they look at me with a blank look, and I'll ask them, more questions, try to pull out what they're not understanding to better explain it. And one of my technicians, which will rope into my next question in a second here, she picked up things in the exam room and used them like models. And she was like, she just grabbed different things, like different cups, and said, like, this is where the diet trial is starting. This is 4 weeks, and this is 8 weeks, and kind of put 3 items in a row. And the owner was completely on board and was like, oh, I get it now. And a combination, I think, of that piggybacking and being shown something in a different way helped that client understand, because this does take some nuance and some practice, so we can't kind of overlook that. Like, you have to learn how to do this in a timely manner, especially when we're all busy doctors running around in these practices. But there's a way to do it, and I think as we practice it and get better, it's going to be super helpful for clients. So, roping into my next question, I did want to ask the group, how can veterinary technicians and other staff members be an asset in client communication, especially in reference to chronic conditions?
I think they can be a great asset because they're usually the first person that the client talks to, like when they're taking the history and they walk in, or also they're the person that answers the phone when the client calls and they have a question or some issues. So they're a person that the client does trust in most occasions. And I say most because some clients can not trust techs, which is unfortunate. But I think techs can be a really fantastic asset, especially if they're well informed. Whenever we hire new techs, I always encourage them to come into the room and listen to the doctor speak and listen to us go over our allergy spiel, so they know like what we're saying, and that way they can answer questions to the clients. Because usually they get questions like, oh, well, while I'm doing the diet trial, what can I use to give Fluffy its pills in? And so those are easy questions that a tech can definitely answer. And also other things, like Chris said, that basically while you're in the room and you're going over your spiels and things, like a lot of clients don't really have a lot of questions because they, like you said, they're in shock, or they just get shy and they don't know, like at the moment the questions don't come up. And usually one thing that I say is, oh, my tech is going to come in and go over the treatment plan. If you think of any questions that she can answer, please feel free to let me know and I'll come back in and talk to you. And I just set that precedent and tell them that they can definitely ask everybody questions.
And I think you touched on a good point. I mean, the technicians are the first face that the clients see when they're getting the history. And a lot of times they're the last face they see when they're giving them, the client, the medications and at-home instructions. So that's one thing that I'll do too with kind of the big important points that we hit, is if it's something I feel like that's really important, really needs to be driven home, I'll say it to the client in the room, and then I'll have the technician repeat it again to the client when they go back in to give them their medication. So that client is hearing the most important information multiple times to help it stick a little better. And then also kind of going back to what Jeff said earlier, sometimes, people, I'm a big believer in communication styles. Like I may communicate with a client really well, and then another doctor may struggle to communicate with that client, or vice versa. There may be a client that I have a difficult time communicating with, but they communicate really well with a different doctor. And it's not that either one of us is in the wrong. It's just the way that they communicate with that specific individual. So there may be someone that I'm speaking to and they're getting it, but they're not quite there. And then the technician comes in, can give them the same information, but maybe spun a different way or worded a little bit differently. And then it clicks with the owner. So again, they get to hear it multiple times to help drive home those key points, but they may also hear it from a different perspective that may be more so their communication style. So again, I think the text can play a very valuable role in that aspect.
And this is Jeff again. And I mean, I totally agree. Adam, you triggered a memory I didn't remember that I had. Andrea, you might remember this back when we were in residency days at our derm conference, and we had to do like this personality training, and they kind of tested us and put us in different categories. And that was the first time I've done personality quizzes before, but they kind of put us in these different groups. And to be brief, I'll just say like some people like are more direct and have short and sweet personalities, and that's how they want to be spoken to in the room. Some people like the long, analytic, thought out answers, and they want to know options A, B, C, D, E, F, and G for their pets. And the short and sweet people may want A and B. And that's what works for them. So we do have to keep those in mind. And there's other categories too. Some people are more sentimental, and they want to feel how you're feeling in the room, and they want a little bit more of an anecdotal story and deeper empathy when you're speaking to them, and vice versa. And so matching those up is really helpful, and trying to recognize that in clients and what they like and what they want is super helpful, because just like Adam said, I am more of that, like I can be short and sweet, but a little bit more analytical. And so I like to give all of the options, but I also try to recognize when some clients are like, I kind of just want to know the top two things that you can offer me, and that's it. And I have a tendency or have to remind myself to cut back for clients that don't want all the information, or just want the most pertinent information. Kind of getting towards the end, one question that I think our opinions hopefully will be helpful for, but what do you tell clients when you have a well-controlled chronic condition, the plan was going well, and they randomly flare up? And feel free to be specific about certain conditions, but they're upset. What do you tell that client?
So this is a very good point, that each condition is different. There's different chronic conditions, but for example, the example of allergies, that's something that I try to set that expectation in the beginning, that periodic flares can happen. It's not going to be something rare. And whenever it happens, I do tell them, hey, like we're going through a specific season. Or if, for a good example, recently we just passed Thanksgiving and I have a pet that's on a special diet, and I asked them, oh, is there any chance that Fluffy got into something at the Thanksgiving table, or if somebody may have slipped him something? And I also approach it in a way, and I try to make sure that the client doesn't feel attacked, because that's very important. Especially if they're upset, I tell them, hey, this is not your fault. You're doing everything right. And sometimes just things are out of our control. Also, for certain autoimmune diseases, there's a lot of factors that can play into flares. Like, for example, with pemphigus and DLE, UV ray exposure is a really big one. So if we're transitioning from winter to spring, or the longer days of the year, and then all of a sudden the dog flares, it's like, oh, we definitely have some adjustments to make, and that's okay. We have to make sure that we're well sun protected and things like that. So it's just, again, a lot of communication, a lot of reminders, a lot of patience too. But mainly, I just try to be as empathetic as possible, and tell the client that it's not their fault. A lot of times it's not their fault. It's just out of their hands whenever these flares happen.
And this is Chris, and we kind of have the same conversations with the allergy type of things. So, but going to arthritis, a lot of times we have them well managed, and then fall happens and then it's winter, and then the dog is not walking well, doing well, and they're like, well, my dog was doing great and now the medicine's not working. It's like, well, it was doing great, but now it's colder out, there's different factors going on. So now I try to set the precedent like way before it's spring and we diagnose him with arthritis, and like, hey, you're going to put him on NSAIDs now, we do everything now. And I said, you're probably going to take them off of it in the summer if you think that they're doing fine. But I said, come fall, like I'm anticipating you're going to be back at the clinic because they're limping again, or they're worse, or you've been on the medication, but now they're limping even more. We might need to kind of tailor our plan for the winter and kind of pivot from there. So plenty of times we've done things where, hey, it's been working great, but now we got to change it. Or now it's been 2 years since we diagnosed this and your dog is now older. So you went from a 10-year-old dog to a 12-year-old dog. That's a big jump for arthritis. So things have changed. And so it's just, again, over communicate, just keep doing that.
Yeah, this is Brandon. I just wanted to say, like, I agree with all of you guys. It's like I set the expectation from the very beginning, like, this is not going to be perfect, and things are going to happen, and we just need to adjust. And there's no shame in something flaring up or going wrong. We just have to do what we can to minimize it in the future. So when flare-ups do happen, it's really important to like talk to the client and see what that was. I liked your food example, especially with Thanksgiving, because we have dogs with chronic gastroenteritis or chronic inflammatory bowel disease. If you can narrow down where the problem happened, then you can avoid it in the future, or at least minimize the chances of it happening again in the future. So I think that's great.
And this is Jeff. I totally agree with everything. I think all of you made really important points. Identify the problem if you can, like Brandon said. Try to avoid it if you can. But with something chronic progressive, it's also important, like Chris mentioned, maybe the medication it's not that the medication is not working. Maybe we're in winter. Maybe that arthritis is worse. And same thing that we deal with over in dermatology world with allergies. We have to interrogate, if it's seasonal atopy, like, are we having warmer weather? Is pollen's longer? But I think the bottom line is identify it if you can, be empathetic, like Andrea said, and meet the clients where they're at. So, if you can just communicate with them well, make them feel heard, make sure they understand where you're coming from, and shift the focus if it needs to be shifted to like, hey, it's not so much that this medication isn't working as well as it should, but we have a chronic progressive disease that is going to continue to get worse, and remind them of things that we probably set the precedent for at the beginning, which they may have forgotten because we deal with these conditions every single day. We might have 8 arthritis things on our schedule, but our client might be seeing us twice a year, so they don't always remember everything. So over communicating, meeting them where they're at, and asking them when they have questions, I think makes for the happiest clients long term, and then shifting their focus if they are upset, and just reminding them, meeting them where they're at, and trying to get back on the same page, I think are all the key points that I heard. So last question of the day, to kind of shift our focus, let's take ourselves back for a second into vet school. And I wanted to ask everyone, can you name a hardship or challenge during vet school and how you overcame it, which made you ultimately a better person? So more of a get to know you, take it back a little bit. What do you guys think? I can go first. So this is John again. So the first one that comes to my mind is, which I think I've mentioned this in a previous episode before, but how I almost failed. Well, actually, I almost failed 2 classes in vet school, but I almost failed anatomy my first year, and I almost failed a class second year. It was whatever the equivalent of like our maybe public health or statistics.
Epidemiology.
That sounds pretty good. Something with math, because I'm historically not good at math. But I got over it. I asked for help. I I specifically asked help from friends and the teachers involved in those classes, and scraped by just to get by. But then in future classes, I would say in life, I learned maybe good reminder to ask for help sooner before you're having major problems. And for what it's worth, that's easier said than done, because I also almost failed a class in undergrad that almost prevented me from graduating. So it took me 3 times to learn that lesson. So have a little grace for yourselves if you're out there and it's taking you a minute to learn a lesson that you think you should have known. Just be kind to yourself.
That's a very good reminder. Always be kind to yourself. And I definitely need to give myself that reminder even up to this day and at this point in my life. I guess one personal challenge for me when I was in veterinary school, it was probably the distance factor from my friends and family back at home, which I did touch up on that on our last episode. And also even with my own personal in my relationship with my husband, because we met during vet school. And just for a little bit of context, he was a 4th year student and I was a 1st year when we first met. So right off the bat, he graduated and he went on to his training. He did internships, residencies, and I did my own thing. So there was a lot of long distance involved, both with friends and family back at home and also with my romantic relationship. So it was very tough. It was very challenging. It was not easy, but definitely there's some things that you can do to overcome that. And I'd say when it comes to a romantic relationship, my advice is trust. Trust and communication is the biggest thing, because if there's no trust and no communication, the relationship is not going to go anywhere. The other thing is also make sure both parties are on the same boat, because maybe one person is definitely down to doing long distance and the other one is not. So make sure that both parties are on the same boat. And then for the friends and family part that I overcame, it's easier said than done, but definitely still like trying to communicate with them as much as possible helped, like still keeping that communication as much as possible, like phone call, FaceTime, those types of things. And also establish new friendships, new local friendships, which is what I had you guys, and new friends, and made a new family in vet school. And that definitely helped me get by through vet school away from home. So yay.
This is Chris. So trying to think back on vet school, and I was studying and trying to get through school was kind of hard. I actually would go back to undergrad, kind of what JT was saying. My sophomore year going in, classes started getting harder for undergrad, and I just didn't know really how to study at that point. I mean, it was just one of those like, what's a good way to study? And high school didn't really prepare me for that. So I actually had to go. I was struggling. I forget which classes it was. I think it was just in general. I'm like, I need to get my grades up to go to vet school. That's the goal. That's what I wanted to do. So I ended up taking a online course on how to study, which sounds silly now. I was like, I just study, but it was like how to break it down and learn how to study. So that kind of helped me out for vet school. So I didn't have to worry. And it was like ask the teachers for help, do things sooner. So that kind of set me up for success later on in school and in vet school to help me out with that. So that was kind of a big challenge before vet school, but I'm glad I had that challenge then versus having it in vet school. But that was the big thing, was just essentially going out and trying to figure it out, how to fix a problem that you don't know that you have. Like, there's a way to figure it out. There's a way to fix it. So I looked online, like, how do I study better? How do I get better grades? And I took this course, and then it essentially helped me out. And it was just putting the work in to do it and following a formula to get better grades, essentially.
This is Brandon. One thing I'll say is, for me, and I'm sure you guys can relate, goes for undergrad and vet school. Like I had some classes where I was just like, this teacher laid this out. They had a great plan for teaching us that was well broken down. Sometimes they gave us notes ahead of time. And then you had other teachers where it's just like they walk up there and just start talking, and then you feel like you're not learning anything. And and I know everyone has a different experience with different teachers and like how that goes. I think for me, it was learning that like ideally every teacher would teach the way I want them to teach and I'd learn the same way every time, but that's just not reality. So like understanding that you need to find a way to, like in the teaching role, like learn these different things that you'll need for NAVLE, for vet school at least, and to be a good veterinarian, and you need to find a way to learn that yourself if you have to. I mean, that even goes for me today in residency. Sometimes there's stuff where I'm just like, I don't know any of this, and I have to go find it and learn it myself. And that's just a part of life in general. So I feel like vet school really pushed me in that, because I felt like up to that point, things had just been relatively easy, aside from, I'd say, like later end of undergrad, like Chris had mentioned. So yeah, just don't expect everything to kind of work in your favor, and especially when it comes to school, even though you're paying X amount of dollars to be there, you might have to kind of do things yourself.
This is Adam. I would say for me, just real quick, going into third and even fourth year, again, you're in that weird transition to where you still have in-class classes, as well as making the transition to clinics. And you're also starting to hit pretty heavy and starting to study for NAVLE on top of trying to find and do your preceptor as well. So just a lot of moving parts as you get into that third and fourth year. And so I think really coming down to time management, I think I learned a lot in terms of how to manage my time for that, with studying for classes, studying for NAVLE, being present for our clinics, and then also finding different options for preceptor as well. And just kind of bringing that all into one realm where I can kind of manage that. So time management, I think, was something big that really had to be a big factor, and something that I had to learn a lot of how to do in that third, fourth year.
Well, I think all of that was really amazing and helpful. I know we went a little long. Hopefully producer Adam will let us keep most of the info. We'll see how things go. But I think we had an excellent discussion. Thank you again, Dr. Hernandez, for being here. And can you tell our listeners where they can find you?
Yes, they can find me on Instagram. My username is AHB_dermavet. That's AHB_DERMAVET.
Thank you. We'll be sure to find you there. And for our listeners, thank you so much for listening to the Dr. Bros. If you enjoyed it, please leave us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or anywhere you listen to podcasts. We'll love you forever. It would also help us if you could share this episode with others who may be interested in today's topic. You can also tell us what you want to hear. You can drop suggestions in the comments or shoot us an email at thedrbros@gmail.com or DM us at thedrbros on Instagram. And maybe we'll feature what you say. So send us some messages. You can reach me on Instagram and on TikTok at DermDrJeff. That's DermDogtorJeff.
This is Brandon. You can reach me on Instagram at DrMasonIM.
Hey, this is Chris. You can reach me on Instagram at dr.chrishernandez.
And this is Adam. You can find me on Instagram at DrAdamDVM. That's DrAdamDVM.